The polished marble floor of Lincoln Center's grand lobby gleamed under the crystal chandeliers as Manhattan's cultural elite gathered for the annual Winter Gala. Among them stood Victoria Sterling, the renowned music industry mogul, whose record label had shaped the careers of countless classical virtuosos. Her sharp eyes surveyed the crowd, mentally cataloging potential investors and emerging talent. At 62, Victoria commanded respect through decades of building an empire that bridged classical tradition with modern commercial success. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The evening's concert had been magnificent, featuring the New York Philharmonic performing pieces by contemporary composers her label had discovered. Victoria felt the familiar rush of pride watching her artists receive standing ovations. Her life's work had been dedicated to preserving classical music's relevance in an increasingly digital world, and tonight represented another victory in that ongoing battle. As the formal reception concluded and guests began filtering toward the exit, Victoria decided to walk the 6 blocks to her penthouse rather than summon her driver. The crisp December air would clear her head after an evening of champagne and networking. Manhattan's winter night embraced her as she stepped onto the sidewalk, her designer coat providing adequate warmth against the gentle snowfall beginning to dust the city. 3 blocks from Lincoln Center, the familiar sounds of street performance reached her ears. Victoria's expression immediately hardened. Street musicians near prestigious venues were nothing new, but they represented everything she fought against in the classical music world: untrained amateurs diminishing the art form's reputation through mediocre performances. These buskers, with their open violin cases hoping for spare change, made a mockery of the years of rigorous training her artists endured. The music grew louder as she approached the subway entrance at 66th and Broadway. A small crowd had gathered around a young performer, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of nearby streetlights. Victoria's pace slowed as the melody reached her ears more clearly. The piece was Paganini's Caprice No. 24, one of the most technically demanding compositions in the violin repertoire. She frowned, certain this street musician was attempting something far beyond his capabilities. Pushing through the gathering crowd, Victoria positioned herself where she could observe the performer directly. What she saw confirmed her worst suspicions about street music's degradation of classical standards. The boy couldn't be more than 16, his clothes clearly second-hand and ill-fitting. His violin case, propped open beside him, contained perhaps $20 in crumpled bills and loose change. His instrument appeared ancient, the varnish worn thin in places, hardly the quality required for serious musical expression. Yet as Victoria listened more intently, something unexpected occurred. The boy's technique, while unrefined by conservatory standards, demonstrated an unusual understanding of the piece's emotional complexity. His fingering wasn't textbook perfect, but his interpretation captured nuances that many professional musicians missed. The crowd around him had grown silent, captivated by his performance in a way that surprised Victoria. Still, principle mattered more than momentary technical competence. This young man represented a fundamental problem in modern classical music: the misconception that raw talent could substitute for proper training and institutional guidance. His performance, regardless of its apparent emotional impact, lacked the disciplined foundation that separated amateur enthusiasm from professional artistry. When the piece concluded, the crowd erupted in enthusiastic applause. Several audience members stepped forward to place bills in the boy's case, their faces reflecting genuine appreciation for what they had witnessed. Victoria watched this scene with growing irritation. These people were being fooled by surface-level charm, unable to recognize the technical deficiencies that made this performance fundamentally inadequate. The boy acknowledged the applause with a modest nod, his dark hair falling across his forehead. As he prepared his next piece, Victoria noticed his hands, long, elegant fingers that suggested natural aptitude, but also calluses and small scars that spoke of struggle and hardship. His posture, while not formally correct, showed an intuitive understanding of how to hold the instrument for optimal sound production. As he raised his bow to begin another piece, Victoria made her decision. The classical music world's integrity demanded that someone with authority speak truth about standards and expectations. These well-meaning audience members needed education about what constituted genuine musical excellence versus mere entertainment. "Excuse me," Victoria called out, her voice cutting through the ambient city noise with practiced authority. The boy's bow paused mid-air as all eyes turned toward her. "I couldn't help but notice your performance." The crowd sensed tension in her tone and shifted restlessly, unsure whether to expect praise or criticism. The young musician lowered, his violin slightly, meeting Victoria's gaze with dark brown eyes that seemed older than his apparent years. Something in his expression suggested he was accustomed to confrontation, prepared for whatever judgment might come. "While I appreciate your enthusiasm for classical music," Victoria continued, her voice carrying the weight of decades in the industry, "I feel obligated to point out that technical proficiency requires more than good intentions. Paganini's caprices demand years of formal training under qualified instructors. What you've just performed, while entertaining to untrained ears, falls significantly short of professional standards." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some audience members looking uncertain while others appeared defensive of the young performer they had just applauded. Victoria pressed forward, convinced that education required uncomfortable truths. The classical music tradition represents centuries of artistic evolution and technical refinement. Street performance, however well-intentioned, fundamentally cheapens that legacy. True mastery requires institutional training, proper instruments, and mentorship from established professionals. Without these foundations, even natural talent becomes merely amateur exhibition. The boy listened to Victoria's critique without visible emotion, his grip on his violin remaining steady despite the public humiliation unfolding around him. When she finished speaking, silence stretched for several uncomfortable seconds. The crowd waited for his response, some shifting awkwardly while others watched with curiosity. Instead of defending himself or arguing with her assessment, the young musician simply raised his violin again. This time, he began Bach's Partita No. 2 in D minor, specifically the famous chaconne movement. Victoria's eyes widened slightly as she recognized the piece, a work so technically and emotionally demanding that even seasoned professionals approached it with reverence and trepidation. What followed challenged every assumption Victoria had made about this street performer. His interpretation of the chaconne demonstrated not just technical competence, but a profound understanding of Bach's architectural complexity. Each variation flowed seamlessly into the next, his phrasing revealing layers of meaning that spoke to years of serious study and practice. The ancient violin in his hands produced sounds of surprising richness and depth, its worn appearance belying its acoustic capabilities. The crowd around them grew larger as passers-by stopped to listen. Even Victoria found herself genuinely analyzing his technique rather than dismissing it outright. His bow control showed sophistication that contradicted his appearance. His intonation remained precise despite the challenging key changes, and his musical memory appeared flawless as he navigated the piece's 15-minute duration without sheet music. More troubling for Victoria was the emotional authenticity in his performance. The chaconne, often called a musical representation of human existence's full spectrum, requires maturity and life experience to interpret meaningfully. This teenager somehow conveyed depths of understanding that suggested suffering and wisdom. Beyond his apparent years, when the final notes faded into the Manhattan night, the silence lasted longer than before. The audience seemed to realize they had witnessed something extraordinary, though few possessed the musical knowledge to articulate exactly what made his performance so compelling. Victoria herself felt unsettled, her professional certainty shaken by what she had just heard. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The boy carefully lowered his violin and looked directly at Victoria. When he spoke, his voice carried quiet dignity despite the public criticism he had just endured. "Thank you for your feedback," he said simply. "I understand your concerns about proper training and institutional standards. Perhaps someday I'll have the opportunity to pursue formal education in music." His response, delivered without bitterness or defensiveness, somehow made Victoria's earlier critique seem petty and cruel. Several audience members shot her disapproving glances as they placed money in the boy's case, their generosity now feeling like statements of support against her judgment. As the crowd began to disperse, Victoria remained rooted in place, watching the young musician pack his instrument with careful precision. His movements suggested reverence for the violin that contradicted her assumptions about street performers' casual relationship with their craft. The way he cleaned the strings and adjusted the bridge spoke to serious musical education, regardless of its formal or informal nature. Something nagged at Victoria as she observed him more closely. His facial features, the shape of his hands, even his unconscious mannerisms while handling the violin triggered a sense of familiarity she couldn't quite place. The feeling grew stronger as she studied his profile in the streetlight's glow, though she couldn't identify its source. "Excuse me," she found herself saying as he prepared to leave. "What's your name?" The boy paused, his violin case half closed, and looked up at her with those dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets. For a moment, Victoria thought he might not answer, perhaps preferring to end their encounter without further interaction. "David," he said finally. "David Chen." The name meant nothing to Victoria, but something in his tone suggested layers of significance she wasn't yet privileged to understand. She nodded awkwardly, uncertain how to continue the conversation after her earlier public criticism. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked, genuine curiosity overriding her professional pride. David's expression shifted slightly, a shadow crossing his features before he answered. "Different places, different teachers." He paused, then added with quiet intensity, "Music finds a way, even when traditional paths aren't available." Before Victoria could respond, David Chen disappeared into the subway entrance, leaving her standing alone on the street corner with questions she couldn't answer, and a growing sense that this encounter represented more than a random meeting. With a talented street musician, Victoria Sterling returned to her penthouse that night with David Chen's performance echoing in her mind. The luxury of her Fifth Avenue apartment, with its panoramic city views and walls lined with gold records and industry awards, felt strangely hollow after witnessing such raw musical authenticity on a street corner. She poured herself a glass of wine and settled into her favorite chair, but sleep remained elusive as questions multiplied in her thoughts. The boy's technique had been undeniably impressive, yet his circumstances suggested a story far more complex than simple musical talent. Street performers, in Victoria's experience, fell into predictable categories: failed conservatory students, aging musicians supplementing retirement income, or amateur hobbyists seeking attention. David Chen fit none of these patterns. His musical maturity suggested serious training, but his apparent poverty indicated barriers that formal education typically provided solutions for. Victoria had built her career on identifying exceptional talent and understanding the industry's pathways to success. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to spot potential in young musicians and guide them toward professional achievement. Her label had launched dozens of careers, transforming, promising students into internationally recognized artists. Yet David Chen represented something outside her usual framework of talent development. The technical precision of his Bach performance particularly troubled her professional assumptions. The chaconne required not just finger dexterity and bow control, but deep structural understanding of Baroque composition principles. Most conservatory students spent months under expert guidance before attempting such a piece publicly. David had performed it from memory, with interpretive sophistication that suggested years of serious study. More unsettling was the emotional authenticity in his playing. Victoria had heard countless technically perfect performances that left audiences cold because they lacked genuine musical communication. David's interpretation of Paganini and Bach had conveyed meaning that transcended technical execution, suggesting life experiences that informed his artistic expression in ways formal training rarely achieved. As the night progressed, Victoria found herself researching David Chen online, though she realized the name might be common enough to make identification difficult. Her searches yielded nothing relevant. No conservatory records, no competition. Results: no social media presence that matched the young man she'd encountered. The absence of digital footprints seemed unusual for any teenager, particularly one with obvious musical abilities. The next morning brought Victoria's regular schedule of meetings and industry obligations, but her concentration remained divided. During a conference call with European distributors, she caught herself thinking about David's violin, the worn instrument that had produced such remarkable sounds. Professional musicians typically invested heavily in their instruments, understanding that superior violins enabled superior performance. David's ability to create beautiful music with obviously modest equipment suggested either exceptional skill or exceptional musical intelligence. Her assistant Rebecca noticed Victoria's distraction during their afternoon strategy session. "Is everything all right? You seem preoccupied today." Victoria hesitated, unsure how to explain her encounter with a street musician had somehow disrupted her professional equilibrium. "I heard an interesting performance last night, a young violinist who showed unusual promise." Rebecca's eyes lit up with professional interest. "Someone we should consider for the label. You know how rare it is to find classical talent that can appeal to broader audiences." "It's complicated," Victoria replied, though she couldn't articulate exactly how or why. He was performing on the street, which raises questions about his background and training. "Street performance doesn't necessarily indicate lack of formal education," Rebecca pointed out practically. "Especially in this economy. Plenty of conservatory graduates supplement their income through busking while building their careers." Victoria nodded, but something about David Chen suggested his circumstances involved more than temporary financial necessity. His entire demeanor had conveyed someone accustomed to struggle, comfortable with hardship in ways that spoke to long-term rather than situational poverty. Yet his musical sophistication indicated access to serious instruction at some point in his development. That evening, Victoria made an unusual decision. Instead of her typical post-work routine of industry dinners or cultural events, she walked back to the subway entrance where she had encountered David. She told herself this was professional curiosity, an extension of her responsibility to identify and develop new talent. The classical music industry needed fresh voices, particularly young artists who could connect with audiences beyond traditional classical demographics. The street corner appeared empty when she arrived, no sign of David or any other performers. Victoria felt oddly disappointed, though she couldn't quite explain her motivation for returning. She lingered for nearly an hour, observing the flow of pedestrian traffic and noting how many people passed without looking for street entertainment. David's ability to gather and hold a crowd suggested charisma that extended beyond musical talent. On her third evening of returning to the same location, Victoria finally found David tuning his violin as early commuters emerged from the subway. He looked up as she approached, his expression registering recognition without surprise, as if he had been expecting her return. "Miss Sterling," he said simply, acknowledging her presence without warmth or hostility. Victoria felt momentarily taken aback that he knew her name, though she realized her prominence in the classical music world made recognition possible for anyone familiar with the industry. "I was hoping to hear you play again," she said, attempting to establish a more positive dynamic than their previous encounter. David nodded and began his evening's performance with a piece Victoria didn't immediately recognize. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, clearly classical in structure, but unfamiliar enough to suggest either an obscure composer or original composition. His interpretation displayed the same emotional depth she had noticed before, but tonight she listened more analytically, trying to understand what made his playing so compelling. As the piece concluded, Victoria applauded along with the small crowd that had gathered. "That was beautiful. I don't think I recognize the composer." "It's something I've been working on," David replied carefully, implying composition rather than interpretation. Victoria's professional interest sharpened immediately. Original composition combined with performance ability suggested artistic maturity rare in someone David's apparent age. Her label actively sought composer-performers who could create and present their own material, understanding that originality provided competitive advantages in the contemporary classical market. "Would you be willing to perform it again? I'd like to listen more carefully." David studied her face for a moment, as if evaluating her motivations, then raised his violin again. This time, Victoria focused on the piece's structural elements rather than just its emotional impact. The composition demonstrated sophisticated understanding of harmonic progression and melodic development, suggesting formal training in music theory beyond simple performance technique. When he finished, Victoria stepped closer to the edge of the small crowd that had gathered. "That's remarkable work. Have you studied composition formally?" "I've studied music in various ways," David answered, with the same careful vagueness he had shown previously. Victoria recognized deliberate evasion when she heard it, but also understood that trust required time to develop. Street performers, particularly young ones, probably encountered many adults with questionable intentions. Her initial criticism had certainly not established her as a sympathetic figure in David's experience. "I owe you an apology," she said directly. "My comments the other night were inappropriate and professionally arrogant. Your musical abilities are clearly far more sophisticated than I initially recognized." David's expression softened slightly, though he remained guarded. "Thank you for saying that. It means something, coming from someone with your reputation." Again, Victoria felt surprised by his knowledge of her professional standing. Most teenagers, even those interested in classical music, wouldn't necessarily recognize prominent industry figures by sight. David's awareness suggested deeper engagement with the classical music world than his circumstances would typically indicate. "How familiar are you with the recording industry?" she asked, testing his knowledge. "Fairly familiar," David replied. "I follow the careers of various artists and understand something about how the business works." His answer revealed more sophistication than Victoria expected. The classical recording industry was complex and specialized, not easily understood without either formal study or direct experience. David's casual familiarity with industry dynamics suggested serious career interest rather than casual musical hobbyism. Over the following weeks, Victoria established a routine of visiting David's performance location several times per week. She told herself this was talent scouting, an extension of her professional responsibilities. David's abilities clearly warranted development opportunities, and Victoria prided herself on nurturing exceptional musicians, regardless of their backgrounds. During these visits, she learned more about David's musical knowledge and capabilities. He could discuss composers and compositions with remarkable depth, analyzing stylistic elements and historical contexts with expertise that suggested extensive study. His performance repertoire seemed limitless, spanning from Baroque masters to contemporary works with equal competence, yet personal details remained elusive. David skillfully deflected questions about his background, education, and living situation without appearing rude or secretive. Victoria sensed deliberate privacy rather than simple shyness, as if David had reasons for maintaining distance that extended beyond normal teenager reticence. "Where do you practice?" Victoria asked one evening after a particularly complex performance. "Different places," David replied with his characteristic vagueness. "Music rooms at libraries, sometimes churches that let me use their space." Victoria tried to imagine maintaining professional-level technique without consistent access to practice facilities. Most serious musicians required hours of daily practice in acoustically appropriate environments. David's ability to perform so competently suggested either remarkable efficiency in his practice routine or access to resources he wasn't acknowledging. "Have you considered applying to conservatories?" She pressed gently. "Your abilities certainly warrant formal recognition." Something flickered across David's features before he answered. "Conservatory education requires financial resources I don't currently have access to." Victoria nodded, understanding the economic barriers that prevented many talented musicians from pursuing formal training. Conservatory tuition, private lessons, and instrument costs created insurmountable obstacles for students without family support or scholarship opportunities. Yet she had also worked with programs that provided assistance for exceptional students facing financial difficulties. "There are scholarship opportunities available," she offered. "I could help you research options that might make conservatory education feasible." David's pause before responding suggested internal debate about how much to reveal. "That's very generous, but my situation is somewhat complicated." Victoria waited for elaboration, but David instead began packing his violin, indicating the evening's performance had concluded. She watched him carefully secure his instrument, noting again the reverence with which he handled equipment that was clearly precious, despite its modest appearance. "David," she said as he prepared to leave, "I'd like to offer you something more concrete than just encouragement." He looked up, his dark eyes reflecting streetlight with an intensity that made Victoria feel as though he could see directly into her thoughts. "My label works with young artists who show exceptional promise. We provide recording opportunities, professional development, and career guidance. I think you might be interested in exploring what we could offer." For the first time since their initial encounter, David's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. Victoria glimpsed something that might have been hope, or possibly fear, before his neutral expression returned. "I appreciate the offer," he said slowly, "but I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of professional engagement." Victoria felt frustrated by his continued resistance to opportunities that most young musicians would embrace eagerly. David's talent clearly warranted professional development, yet he seemed determined to maintain his current circumstances despite their obvious limitations. "What would make you ready?" she asked directly. David shouldered his violin case and met her gaze with unexpected directness. "Time," he said simply. "Some things can't be rushed, regardless of how talented someone might appear." As he disappeared into the subway entrance, Victoria realized her encounters with David Chen had become the most intriguing professional challenge she had faced in years. His musical abilities demanded recognition and development, yet his personal circumstances remained mysteriously opaque. Something about his situation felt incomplete, as if crucial information was being deliberately withheld. That night, Victoria made several calls to colleagues who specialized in identifying and developing young classical talent. She described David's abilities without mentioning his name or street performance context, focusing on his technical competence and original compositions. The responses were universally encouraging. Musicians with David's described capabilities were rare and valuable, definitely worth pursuing for professional development. Yet Victoria also sensed something deeper in her interest that transcended professional opportunity recognition. David Chen triggered feelings of familiarity she couldn't explain, emotional responses that seemed disproportionate to their brief acquaintance. Something about his mannerisms, his musical interpretations, even his physical appearance resonated with memories she couldn't quite access. She found herself studying her own reflection in the mirror, searching for physical characteristics that might explain her sense of recognition when looking at David. Their coloring was different, her blonde hair and blue eyes contrasting with his dark features, but something about bone structure and facial proportions seemed familiar in ways that suggested more than coincidence. Victoria's sleep that night was interrupted by dreams filled with music and memories she couldn't quite grasp upon waking. Images of a younger version of herself, relationships from decades past, and melodies that seemed to bridge different periods of her life blended together in confusing narratives that felt significant but remained frustratingly unclear. The next morning brought an unusual phone call from Rebecca, who rarely contacted Victoria outside normal business hours. "I've been thinking about the young violinist you mentioned," Rebecca said without preamble. "The street performer with unusual talent. I did some research into busking permits and subway performance regulations, trying to understand how someone that's skilled might end up in those circumstances." Victoria felt her attention sharpen. "What did you discover?" "It's interesting. Legal street performance in subway stations requires permits and auditions. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority actually has quite selective standards for their official busking program. Someone performing at the level you described would almost certainly be part of their formal system." Meaning? Meaning either he's performing illegally, which seems unlikely given the locations and times you described, or he's been officially approved by MTA auditions. Those auditions are competitive and judge technical competence pretty rigorously. Victoria processed this information, realizing it suggested David's circumstances might be more complex than simple financial necessity. Official busking permits indicated engagement with institutional systems, yet he had portrayed himself as existing outside formal musical networks. "There's something else," Rebecca continued. "I contacted a friend who works with the MTA's music programs. She said they've had applications and performances from several exceptionally talented young musicians over the past few years. Musicians whose abilities seem to exceed what you typically expect from street performers." Did she mention any names? She couldn't provide specific information about individual performers, but she did say that some of these musicians seemed to be using street performance as a way of maintaining anonymity rather than seeking recognition, as if they were deliberately choosing public spaces that allowed them to practice and perform without creating permanent records or official attention. Victoria felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to arrange themselves in her mind, though the complete picture remained unclear. David's talent, his knowledge of the industry, his careful privacy, and his apparent comfort with street performance despite obvious sophistication all suggested a story more complex than anything she had initially considered. That evening, Victoria arrived at David's usual performance location with specific questions she intended to ask, regardless of his typical evasiveness. She needed to understand whether her growing sense of connection to this young musician was based on professional intuition or something more personal that she had yet to identify. David was already performing when she arrived, his music drawing the usual small crowd of commuters and passers-by. Tonight, he was playing Vivaldi's Winter from the Four Seasons, his interpretation bringing fresh emotional depth to the familiar composition. Victoria listened carefully, analyzing not just his technique, but his interpretive choices, the subtle variations he brought to well-known passages. As the piece concluded, Victoria stepped forward before the crowd dispersed. "David, I need to ask you something directly." He lowered his violin, his expression becoming guarded as he sensed the change in her tone. "Are you David Chen?" she asked. "Is that actually your name?" The question hung in the air between them, and Victoria watched his face carefully for any reaction that might provide clarity. For a moment, David's carefully maintained composure faltered completely, and she glimpsed something that looked like pain mixed with recognition. "Why would you ask me that?" he replied, his voice carefully controlled despite the emotion Victoria had briefly seen. "Because everything about you suggests this situation is more complicated than you've indicated. Your musical knowledge, your performance abilities, your familiarity with the industry, even your comfort with anonymity. None of it adds up to a simple story of a talented street musician." David remained silent for several long seconds, his hands gripping his violin as if it were an anchor in turbulent waters. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Victoria realize she was about to learn something that would change everything. "My name is David Chen," he said slowly, "but that's not the name I was born with." Victoria felt the world shift slightly around her as David's words registered. The busy street corner, the ambient noise of Manhattan traffic, even the cold December air seemed to fade into background as she processed what he had just revealed. David Chen was not his birth name, which meant everything she thought she understood about this encounter required reconsideration. "What name were you born with?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the city sounds surrounding them. David's grip on his violin case tightened, his knuckles showing white in the streetlight's glow. For a moment, Victoria thought he might refuse to answer, might simply walk away and disappear back into the anonymity of the subway system. Instead, he took a deep breath and met her eyes with an expression that combined resignation with something that might have been relief. "David Sterling," he said quietly. The name hit Victoria like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her grab the nearby railing for support. Sterling, her name. Her family name that she had fought to establish in the music industry, that adorned her record label and represented decades of professional achievement. But more than that, Sterling was a name that connected to memories she had buried so deeply that they felt like fragments from someone else's life. "That's impossible," she whispered. Though even as she spoke, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't realized existed began clicking into place with terrifying clarity. David watched her reaction with eyes that seemed far older than his 16 years, as if he had been preparing for this moment and understood its impact better than she did. "Is it?" he asked gently. "Is it really impossible, Victoria?" The use of her first name, spoken with familiar intimacy rather than professional respect, sent another shock through Victoria's system. She stared at this young man she had encountered, by chance, seeing him now through a completely different lens. The facial features that had triggered vague recognition, the musical sophistication that seemed beyond his apparent circumstances, the careful way he had deflected personal questions. Everything took on new significance. "How old are you?" she managed to ask, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. 17, David replied. I'll be 18 in March. Victoria's mind raced backward through time, calculating dates and remembering a period of her life she had spent years trying to forget. 17 years ago would place his birth in the spring of 2007, during the most turbulent and painful chapter of her personal history. The timeline aligned with memories she had locked away, experiences that had shaped her in ways she rarely acknowledged even to herself. "Your mother," Victoria said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "What was her name?" "Sarah Chen," David answered, watching Victoria's face carefully for recognition, "though I think you knew her by a different name." Victoria's legs felt weak as another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Sarah Chen, Sarah Liu, the brilliant young pianist who had briefly been part of Victoria's life during her early 30s, when success was new and loneliness was constant. Sarah, with her extraordinary musical gifts and gentle spirit, who had appeared in Victoria's world like a shooting star and disappeared just as suddenly, leaving behind only memories and regrets that Victoria had never fully processed. Sarah Liu, Victoria whispered, the name carrying weight of emotions she thought she had successfully buried. David nodded slowly. She took the name Chen when she moved to California, started over, built a new life. But yes, you knew her as Sarah. Liu, the street corner suddenly felt surreal, as if Victoria had stumbled into an alternate reality where past and present collided without warning. She remembered Sarah with painful clarity now. The late-night conversations about music and art, the way Sarah's eyes lit up when she played piano, the brief period when Victoria had allowed herself to imagine a different kind of life than the one she had built through relentless professional ambition. "She never told me," Victoria said, though she wasn't sure whether she was making a statement or asking a question. "She tried," David replied, his voice carrying a gentleness that somehow made his words more devastating. "She called your office several times when I was very young. Your assistant always said you were too busy to take personal calls." Victoria felt the ground shift beneath her feet again as she remembered her deliberate policy during those years of avoiding personal entanglements that might distract from her career trajectory. She had instructed Rebecca's predecessor to screen all calls, accepting only those directly related to business opportunities. Personal relationships had seemed like luxuries she couldn't afford while building her empire. "She stopped trying after a while," David continued, his tone remaining carefully neutral. "Said you had made your priorities clear, and she respected that choice." The casual way he delivered this information felt like a knife through Victoria's chest. She tried to imagine Sarah, pregnant and alone, attempting to reach the father of her child, only to be systematically blocked by professional gatekeepers. The image was unbearable, yet it aligned perfectly with the ruthless focus Victoria had maintained during her rise to industry prominence. "Why didn't she persist?" Victoria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because she loved you," David said simply. "And she understood that forcing someone into parenthood against their clear wishes wouldn't be fair to anyone, especially not to a child." Victoria stared at this young man who was apparently her son, seeing Sarah's gentleness in his expression. Despite the strength required to survive whatever circumstances had led him to street performance, the combination of familiar and foreign elements in his appearance made sense now. He carried physical traits from both parents, blended in ways that created something entirely new, yet recognizably connected to both origins. "Where is she now?" Victoria asked, though something in David's expression suggested she might not want to hear the answer. "She died 3 years ago," David replied quietly. "Cancer. She fought it for almost 2 years, but the treatments were expensive and insurance didn't cover everything." The final blow landed with devastating impact. Sarah was gone, had been gone for years, while Victoria remained obliviously focused on business acquisitions and market expansion. The woman who had briefly shown her what love might feel like, who had apparently borne and raised their child alone, had faced terminal illness without any support from the father of her son. "Did she ever mention me?" Victoria asked, needing to know whether Sarah had harbored resentment or had somehow found peace with the situation. "Often," David said, surprising her. "She kept newspaper articles about your successes, followed your career developments online. She was proud of what you had accomplished, even though it meant there wasn't room in your life for us." Victoria felt tears threatening, an emotional response she rarely allowed herself in professional or personal contexts. The idea that Sarah had continued to care about her welfare, had celebrated her achievements from a distance while struggling to raise their child alone, seemed almost unbearably generous. "Why are you here?" Victoria asked, trying to understand how this encounter had come to happen. "Why New York? Why this corner? Why now?" David shifted his violin case to his other hand, a gesture that reminded Victoria of her own nervous habits when facing difficult conversations. "I've been in New York for about a year. Mum left me some money when she died, enough to get established somewhere new. I wanted to understand where I came from, what my other half was like." "So you've been watching me?" "Research," David corrected gently. "I learned about your company, your artists, your reputation in the industry. I wanted to know who Victoria Sterling was before I decided whether to make contact." Victoria realized that their encounter 3 weeks ago had not been coincidental. David had deliberately chosen to perform near Lincoln Center, knowing she might be in the area, creating an opportunity for natural meeting rather than forced introduction. His reaction to her initial criticism made more sense now. He'd been prepared for rejection, probably expected it based on what he knew about her professional persona. "And what did you conclude?" she asked. "About who Victoria Sterling is?" David was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the streetlights' glow. "That you're brilliant and successful and dedicated to your art," he said finally. "Also that you're probably lonely and afraid of letting people get close enough to disappoint you." The accuracy of his assessment was startling. Victoria had spent decades perfecting a professional image that projected confidence and control while carefully concealing the personal emptiness that success had never quite filled. That a teenager could see through her carefully constructed facade with such clarity was both impressive and unsettling. "Your mother was always perceptive about people," Victoria said, remembering Sarah's uncanny ability to understand motivations and emotions that others missed. "She taught me to pay attention," David agreed, said understanding people was as important as understanding music. Victoria noticed how naturally he spoke about Sarah's influence, the way her wisdom had shaped his perspective even years after her death. The love between mother and son was evident in every reference, making Victoria acutely aware of what she had missed by not being part of their lives. "What do you want from me?" she asked, needing to understand his intentions now that the truth was revealed. "Nothing," David replied, surprising her again. "I didn't seek you out to demand anything or create obligations you don't want. I just wanted to see who you were, to understand that part of my heritage." Victoria felt frustrated by his apparent lack of expectations. Most people who discovered connections to successful individuals wanted something: money, opportunities, recognition, relationships. David's disinterest in leveraging their relationship for personal gain seemed almost unnatural. "But you must want something," she pressed. "College tuition, career opportunities, financial support. I have resources that could change your life completely." David's expression shifted slightly, and Victoria glimpsed something that might have been sadness before his neutral mask returned. "What I wanted was a father," he said quietly, "but that opportunity passed years ago. I'm not interested in a business relationship or charitable arrangement now." The honesty of his response cut deep, highlighting the irreversible nature of missed opportunities and lost time. Victoria realized that money and professional connections, the tools she typically used to solve problems, were inadequate for addressing the fundamental absence that defined their relationship. "It doesn't have to be a business arrangement," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure what alternative she was offering. "Doesn't it?" David asked gently. "What else could it be at this point? I'm 17 years old, almost an adult. I've grown up without a father, learned to be independent, developed my own relationship with music and life. You're a stranger who happens to share my DNA." Victoria felt the brutal truth of his words, while also recognizing the defensive mechanisms that probably protected him from hoping for connections that might disappoint him. She understood those mechanisms intimately, having developed similar emotional shields during her own rise to success. "We could get to know each other," she offered tentatively, "as people, not as business associates or charity cases." David studied her face for a long moment, as if evaluating her sincerity. "And then what? You return to your life of board meetings and recording sessions. I continue performing on street corners. We exchange holiday cards and pretend we have a relationship." Victoria realized he was challenging her to consider what genuine connection might require, what sacrifices or changes she would be willing to make to build something authentic rather than superficial. The question forced her to confront how thoroughly her identity had become integrated with her professional success, leaving little room for personal relationships that didn't serve career objectives. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "I don't have much experience with family relationships that aren't complicated by business considerations." "At least you're honest about it," David said, and Victoria detected the first hint of warmth in his tone since their conversation began. They stood in awkward silence for several minutes, both processing the implications of revelations that had fundamentally altered their understanding of each other and themselves. Victoria watched pedestrians flow around them, ordinary people living ordinary lives that probably included normal family relationships with their natural complications and rewards. "Would you be willing to have dinner?" Victoria asked finally. "Somewhere private where we could talk without street noise and interruptions." David hesitated, clearly weighing the invitation against his own protective instincts. "As long as you understand that one dinner doesn't create obligations for either of us." Victoria nodded, accepting his terms while hoping that conversation might reveal possibilities neither of them could currently imagine. "Tomorrow evening, I know a quiet restaurant where we won't be interrupted." "Okay," David agreed, "but I choose how I get there and how I leave. No car service, no arranged transportation." Victoria recognized his need to maintain independence and control over his circumstances. "Of course. Shall we say 7 o'clock at Café Sabarsky? It's small and usually not crowded on weeknights." David nodded, familiar with the location. As he prepared to leave, slinging his violin case over his shoulder with practiced ease, Victoria felt compelled to say something that might bridge the enormous gap between them. "David," she called softly, "I'm sorry for not being there, for not knowing, for everything you and your mother went through alone." He paused, turning back to face her with an expression that combined acknowledgement with something that might have been forgiveness. "She never wanted you to feel guilty about choosing your career," he said. "She understood that not everyone is meant for parenthood, and she respected your right to live the life you wanted." With that, David disappeared into the subway entrance, leaving Victoria alone on the street corner with the weight of 17 years of missed opportunities and the fragile possibility of something different moving forward. Victoria spent the following day in a state of distraction that her colleagues noticed but politely ignored. During a morning meeting with potential investors, she found herself staring out the conference room windows instead of focusing on financial projections. Rebecca had to repeat questions twice before Victoria registered that responses were expected. "Are you feeling all right?" Rebecca asked privately after the investors left. "You seem unusually unfocused today." Victoria considered how to explain that she had discovered a son she never knew existed, that her carefully ordered life had been fundamentally disrupted by a street musician who carried her DNA and her former lover's gentle spirit. The words seemed too large and strange to speak aloud. "I'm processing some unexpected personal information," she said finally. "It's affecting my concentration more than I anticipated." Rebecca nodded understandingly, accustomed to Victoria's occasional need for privacy around personal matters. "Should I reschedule this afternoon's appointments?" "No," Victoria replied, recognizing that work provided necessary distraction. From emotional complexity, she wasn't prepared to fully examine. "I'll manage." But managing proved more difficult than Victoria expected. Throughout the day, she found herself studying her reflection in office windows and mirrors, searching for physical characteristics that might have been passed to David. She noticed details she had never paid attention to before: the shape of her hands, the way she held her head when concentrating, unconscious gestures that might have been inherited, along with musical aptitude. By evening, Victoria felt nervous in ways she hadn't experienced since her early career, when important meetings could determine her professional future. She changed clothes 3 times, settling finally on casual elegance that wouldn't seem like she was trying too hard to impress her own son. The absurdity of the situation, preparing for dinner with a young man who was simultaneously a stranger and her closest blood relative, wasn't lost on her. Café Sabarsky occupied a corner of the Neue Gallery, its Viennese decor creating an atmosphere of old-world elegance without the intimidating formality of Victoria's usual restaurant choices. She arrived 10 minutes early and secured a corner table that would provide privacy for whatever conversation might unfold. David appeared precisely at 7 o'clock, his punctuality suggesting nervousness that matched her own, despite his apparent composure. He had changed from his street performance clothes into clean jeans and a simple sweater that somehow made him look more his actual age. Without his violin case, he seemed smaller, more vulnerable, though his bearing still carried the dignity she had noticed during their previous encounters. "Thank you for coming," Victoria said as he sat across from her, immediately feeling foolish for the formal tone. "Thank you for suggesting it," David replied with equal politeness, creating an atmosphere of careful courtesy that highlighted the strangeness of their situation. They ordered quietly, both choosing simple dishes that wouldn't require much attention, allowing focus to remain on conversation. When the server left them alone, silence stretched uncomfortably until Victoria decided directness might serve them better than continued awkwardness. "I have about 1,000 questions," she admitted, "but I'm not sure which ones are appropriate to ask." David's expression relaxed slightly at her honesty. "You can ask anything you want. I might not answer everything, but I won't be offended by curiosity." Victoria appreciated his straightforward approach, recognizing it as another trait that might have come from Sarah's influence. "What was your childhood like? Were you happy?" "Mostly yes," David answered thoughtfully. "Mom worked hard to make sure I had everything I needed, even when money was tight. She taught piano lessons and played for churches to supplement her income from office work. We moved around some when I was young, but she always made wherever we lived feel like home." Victoria tried to imagine Sarah juggling multiple jobs while raising a child alone, creating stability despite financial uncertainty. The image made her feel simultaneously grateful for Sarah's strength and guilty about her own absence from their struggles. "When did you start playing violin?" she asked. "Around age 6. Mom wanted me to learn piano first, said it would give me better musical foundation, but I was drawn to violin from the first time I heard one." She found a teacher who would trade lessons for Mum's piano accompaniment services. Victoria nodded, understanding how musical families often created informal networks of mutual support. "Your technique suggests extensive training. How did you maintain that level of instruction?" "Different teachers in different places," David explained. "Mum was good at finding musicians who would work with us financially. Sometimes I helped with their students in exchange for my own lessons. When Mum got sick, I had to become more self-directed." The casual mention of Sarah's illness created a moment of silence as Victoria processed the implications. David had continued developing his musical abilities even while caring for a terminally ill mother, probably shouldering responsibilities far beyond what most teenagers experienced. "Were you with her when she died?" Victoria asked gently. David nodded, his expression becoming distant. "The last few months were difficult. She was in and out of hospitals, and I spent a lot of time in waiting rooms practicing on a cheap electric violin so I wouldn't disturb other families." Victoria felt her chest tighten at the image of her son maintaining his musical discipline in hospital corridors while watching his mother die slowly. The strength required for such circumstances seemed extraordinary for someone who had been just 14 years old. "How did you manage after she was gone?" "Foster care for a while," David said matter-of-factly. "The family was nice enough, but they didn't understand about music practice, and I couldn't access my violin as much as I needed. When I turned 16, I petitioned for emancipation and moved out on my own." Victoria stared at him across the table, trying to comprehend the independence and maturity required to navigate legal systems and adult responsibilities at 16. Most teenagers in her social circles were worried about college applications and social drama, not housing and financial survival. "How do you support yourself?" "Street performance pays better than you might expect, especially if you're good enough to draw crowds. I also give private lessons to beginning students and sometimes play for events or parties. It's not luxurious, but I manage." Victoria realized that David had created a complete life for himself outside traditional support systems, using his musical abilities to generate income while maintaining artistic integrity. His independence was remarkable, but also highlighted how unnecessary her presence had become in his practical existence. "Do you have friends, people you're close to?" David smiled for the first time since sitting down, transforming his serious expression into something that reminded Victoria strongly of Sarah. "A few. Other musicians mostly, people who understand the lifestyle. There's a community of performers who look out for each other." Victoria felt relieved that he wasn't completely isolated, though she also recognized that his social connections were based on shared circumstances rather than normal teenage experiences. "Do any of them know about me? About our relationship?" "No," David replied immediately. "That's not information I share casually." Victoria understood his discretion, but also felt curious about his reasons for maintaining privacy. "Are you ashamed of the connection?" David considered the question seriously before answering. "Not ashamed exactly, but explaining that my successful industry executive mother doesn't know I exist tends to create awkward conversations." Victoria winced at his characterization, accurate though it was. From his perspective, she was indeed a successful executive who had remained ignorant of his existence, regardless of the circumstances that had created that situation. "What did your mother tell you about me?" she asked, needing to understand how Sarah had explained her absence. That you were brilliant and passionate about music and completely dedicated to your career, David replied. She said you lived your life at intensity levels that didn't leave room for other people, and she respected that choice, even though it meant raising me alone. Victoria felt struck by the generosity of Sarah's interpretation, the way she had protected both Victoria's reputation and David's feelings by framing the situation as mutual incompatibility rather than abandonment or rejection. Did she seem bitter? Angry about being left to manage everything herself? Never, David said firmly. She talked about you with affection and admiration. Said the time you spent together was brief but meaningful, and she never regretted having me even. Though circumstances weren't ideal, Victoria felt tears threaten again at Sarah's continued generosity, even in memory. She was a remarkable person. Yes, David agreed simply. She was. They ate in contemplative silence for several minutes, both processing the emotional weight of their conversation. Victoria found herself studying David's face, noting expressions and mannerisms that triggered faint recognition, while also cataloguing differences that made him uniquely himself, rather than simply a combination of parental traits. "What do you want to do with your musical abilities?" she asked eventually. "Long-term career goals, artistic aspirations." David's expression became more animated as he considered the question. "I'd like to compose more seriously, perform my own work rather than just interpreting other people's pieces, maybe record someday, but independently maintaining control over artistic decisions." Victoria recognized the independence theme that seemed to define David's approach to most aspects of his life. His artistic goals aligned with contemporary trends towards self-produced music, though classical composition required different pathways than popular music. "Composition is challenging commercially," she observed. "Most classical composers struggle to make living wages from original work." "I know," David replied, "but financial success isn't my primary motivation. I want to create music that means something, that connects with people emotionally." Victoria heard echoes of her own artistic idealism from decades earlier, before commercial considerations had gradually shifted her focus toward market viability rather than pure artistic expression. David's commitment to meaning over money felt both admirable and impractical given his current circumstances. "You could have both," she suggested carefully. "Commercial success and artistic integrity aren't mutually exclusive if you approach them strategically." David studied her face, apparently evaluating whether she was offering advice or making a sales pitch. "Are you speaking as an industry professional or as someone who might be personally invested in my success?" Victoria realized she wasn't entirely sure herself. Her professional instincts recognized David's commercial potential, but her personal feelings were more complex and harder to define. "Both, I think. Is that a problem?" "Not necessarily," David replied, "as long as we're both clear about which perspective you're operating from at any given time." Victoria appreciated his ability to separate different types of relationships and maintain boundaries that protected his interests, while allowing for multiple forms of connection. "Fair enough. Would you be interested in hearing about opportunities that might advance your artistic goals while also providing financial stability?" David's pause suggested internal debate about how much professional involvement to accept from someone who was simultaneously his biological parent and a powerful industry figure. "I'd be willing to listen," he said finally. "But I want to be clear that I'm not looking for special treatment based on our relationship." Victoria nodded, understanding his need to maintain integrity around his achievements and opportunities. "Everything I might suggest would be based solely on your demonstrated abilities. I've heard you perform. I know what you're capable of." David relaxed slightly, apparently reassured by her acknowledgement of merit-based evaluation. What kind of opportunities? Victoria felt her professional enthusiasm engage as she considered possibilities for someone with David's unique combination of technical skill, original composition ability, and performance charisma. Recording opportunities, for one thing. My label works with classical artists who can appeal to broader audiences. Your street performance experience suggests you understand how to connect with diverse listeners. David leaned forward slightly, his interest evident despite his careful neutrality. What would that involve? Demo recordings first, to document your original compositions and establish your artistic identity. If those demonstrate commercial potential, we could discuss album development and distribution through our established networks. Victoria watched David process this information, noting the way his expression shifted between professional interest and personal wariness. She realized he was evaluating whether her offer represented genuine artistic opportunity or an attempt to assuage guilt about their relationship through professional advancement. "I'd want complete artistic control," David said eventually, "over repertoire selection, arrangement choices, final production decisions." Victoria felt impressed by his understanding of industry dynamics and his willingness to negotiate terms that protected his creative vision. That's unusual for new artists, but not impossible depending on the specific arrangement. "And I'd want any professional relationship to be separate from personal interactions," David continued. "If we decide to explore being father and daughter, in some capacity that can't influence business decisions or create expectations about career obligations." Victoria realized David was demonstrating sophistication about boundary management that many professional artists never developed. His insistence on separation between personal and professional relationships showed maturity that suggested he had learned hard lessons about protecting himself from exploitation or manipulation. "I agree completely," Victoria said. "Those boundaries would protect both of us from conflicts of interest." David studied her face for signs of insincerity before nodding slowly. "Then I'd be interested in hearing more specific details about what recording opportunities might involve." Victoria felt a surge of excitement about the professional possibilities, combined with cautious hope about their personal relationship. For the first time since discovering David's existence, she could envision pathways forward that might serve both his artistic development and their gradual exploration of family connection. "I'd like to arrange studio time for you to record several of your original compositions," she began, shifting into professional mode while maintaining awareness of the personal dynamics underlying their conversation. "High-quality recordings that could demonstrate your abilities to industry professionals and potential audiences." David listened intently as Victoria outlined possibilities for documentation, development, and eventual distribution of his musical work. The conversation gradually shifted from tentative personal exploration toward detailed discussion of artistic strategy and career development, creating a framework where their professional and personal relationships might coexist without compromising either. As dinner concluded, Victoria felt cautiously optimistic about the foundation they had established for moving forward. David remained guarded, but seemed willing to explore both musical opportunities and family connection with appropriate boundaries, protecting his independence and artistic integrity. "Would you be available for studio sessions next week?" Victoria asked as they prepared to leave. "Yes," David replied. "But I choose which compositions to record and maintain final approval over any use of the recordings." Victoria nodded, accepting his terms while appreciating his protective instincts. "Of course, this is about documenting your art, not controlling it." As they parted ways outside the restaurant, Victoria felt like she was stepping into uncharted territory where professional expertise and personal discovery would need to navigate carefully around each other. For the first time in years, she faced a relationship that couldn't be managed through business strategies alone, requiring emotional skills she wasn't sure she possessed but was willing to develop. The recording studio buzzed with quiet activity as Victoria watched David adjust his posture behind the microphone, his violin poised with the same careful precision she had observed during his street performances. 3 weeks had passed since their dinner conversation, 3 weeks of tentative phone calls and carefully planned meetings that gradually built trust between them. Today marked their first professional collaboration, a step that felt simultaneously natural and surreal. David had chosen 4 original compositions for the session, pieces that showcased different aspects of his musical personality. Victoria sat in the control room alongside Marcus, her senior recording engineer, observing David's preparation ritual through the soundproof glass. The way he tuned his instrument, tested the acoustics, and positioned himself relative to the microphones suggested professional experience that exceeded what street performance would typically provide. "He knows what he's doing," Marcus commented quietly, noting David's efficient setup process. "Most first-time recording artists need extensive coaching about studio protocols." Victoria nodded, though she had stopped being surprised by David's competence in unfamiliar situations. His ability to adapt quickly while maintaining artistic focus seemed to be another inherited trait, one that had served him well during his unconventional path to musical development. As David began his first piece, a haunting melody in minor key that he had titled Departures, Victoria felt her breath catch slightly. The studio's pristine acoustics revealed layers of nuance in his playing that street performance had only hinted at. His technique remained imperfect by conservatory standards, but his musical communication was extraordinary, conveying emotional depths that transcended technical precision. The composition itself demonstrated sophisticated understanding of harmonic structure and melodic development. Victoria found herself analyzing the piece professionally while also experiencing it emotionally, recognizing influences from classical masters blended with contemporary sensibilities that created something entirely original. David's artistic voice was clearly formed, mature beyond his years, yet distinctly his own. When the first take concluded, David looked toward the control room for feedback. Victoria pressed the intercom button, choosing her words carefully to maintain professional objectivity despite her personal investment in his success. "That was beautiful," she said honestly. "The emotional arc of the piece came through clearly. Would you like to try another take, or shall we move to the next composition?" "I'd like to do one more," David replied. "I think I can bring out the counter-melody more clearly in the middle section." Victoria smiled at his perfectionist instincts, recognizing another shared trait. Throughout her career, she had worked with artists who settled for adequate first takes and others who pursued excellence through multiple attempts until every detail met their standards. David clearly belonged to the latter category. His second performance of Departures incorporated subtle adjustments that enhanced the piece's emotional impact while demonstrating his ability to self-evaluate and refine his interpretation. Victoria made notes about arrangement possibilities, thinking about string sections or piano accompaniment that might complement his solo violin work without overwhelming its intimate character. The session continued through David's remaining compositions: Urban Lullaby, inspired by late-night subway sounds, Mother's Waltz, a tender tribute to Sarah's memory, and Ascending, an optimistic piece that suggested hope emerging from struggle. Each work revealed different facets of David's artistic personality while maintaining stylistic consistency that spoke to a mature creative vision. As the recording session concluded, Victoria felt excited about the commercial potential of David's music while also experiencing pride that she couldn't entirely separate from their personal relationship. She had discovered and developed many talented artists over the years, but none had affected her as deeply as hearing her son's original compositions captured in professional quality recordings. "How did that feel?" she asked David as he packed his violin, the formal recording process complete. "Strange," David admitted with a slight smile. "Good strange, though. Hearing my music through those speakers, knowing it's being preserved properly, it makes the compositions feel more real, somehow." Victoria understood the significance of professional documentation for any serious artist. Recordings transformed ephemeral performances into permanent artifacts that could be shared, studied, and preserved beyond the limitations of live performance. For David, who had spent years playing for temporary audiences on street corners, the permanence probably felt especially meaningful. "What happens next?" David asked, apparently genuinely curious about industry processes rather than anxious about outcomes. "I'll have Marcus create rough mixes of each piece," Victoria explained. "Then we'll evaluate them together and decide whether additional recording is needed or if we're ready to move toward final production." David nodded, accepting the timeline without pressure for immediate results. His patience impressed Victoria, especially given his youth and the excitement that typically accompanied first recording experiences. She suspected his measured approach reflected hard-learned lessons about not becoming overly invested in outcomes beyond his control. Over the following weeks, Victoria found herself thinking about David's music during quiet moments between professional obligations. His compositions possessed a quality that distinguished them from the countless demo recordings she reviewed annually. The emotional authenticity in his work suggested life experiences that informed his artistic expression in ways that formal training alone couldn't provide. When the rough mixes were ready, Victoria invited David to her office for a private listening session. The executive suite's high-end sound system would provide optimal conditions for evaluating the recordings and discussing potential next steps in their development. David arrived precisely on time, carrying a small notebook that Victoria assumed contained his thoughts about the compositions and recording process. His consistent punctuality had become one of many small details that highlighted his professionalism, despite his unconventional background. "Before we listen," Victoria said, as they settled into comfortable chairs positioned optimally for the room's acoustics, "I want you to know that regardless of what we decide about commercial potential, these recordings document remarkable artistic achievement." David met her gaze with appreciation for her acknowledgement, while maintaining the emotional distance that had characterized their interactions since discovering their relationship. "Thank you. That means something coming from someone with your experience." Victoria played each composition in the order David had recorded them, watching his face for reactions while also experiencing the pieces with fresh perspective provided by studio-quality reproduction. The recordings revealed details she had missed during the live session, subtle harmonic choices and rhythmic variations that demonstrated David's compositional sophistication. Urban Lullaby emerged as particularly striking, its blend of classical violin techniques with unconventional rhythmic elements that evoked subway trains and city nightlife. The piece suggested possibilities for crossover appeal that might attract audiences beyond traditional classical demographics. "This one has commercial potential," Victoria observed as the track concluded. "The urban influences make it accessible while maintaining classical integrity." David nodded thoughtfully. "It's probably the most autobiographical piece I've written. All those nights, riding trains between performances, finding musical patterns in mechanical sounds." Victoria felt moved by his ability to transform difficult, circumstances into artistic inspiration, recognizing resilience that had enabled him to thrive despite obstacles that might have defeated other young musicians. His capacity to find beauty in hardship seemed to reflect Sarah's influence, her ability to create meaning from whatever life provided. Mother's Waltz proved equally compelling, though in completely different ways. The piece's gentle melancholy captured grief and love simultaneously, expressing complex emotions with remarkable maturity. Victoria found herself thinking about Sarah as she listened, imagining the relationship between mother and son that had inspired such tender musical tribute. "Would you consider allowing orchestral arrangements of some pieces?" Victoria asked, when they had finished reviewing all 4 recordings. "I'm thinking particularly about Mother's Waltz and Ascending. String arrangements might enhance their emotional impact without compromising their essential character." David considered the suggestion carefully before responding. "As long as I have input on the arrangements and final approval over any changes to the compositions themselves." Victoria appreciated his protective instincts regarding his artistic work, while recognizing the collaborative potential that orchestral development might provide. "Of course, I'm thinking about enhancement, not transformation." Their conversation gradually shifted from specific compositions toward broader questions about David's artistic goals and career development. Victoria learned that he had written nearly 20 pieces over the past 2 years, drawing inspiration from his experiences as an independent young musician navigating adult responsibilities while maintaining artistic focus. "I'd like to hear your other compositions," Victoria said. "Not necessarily for immediate recording, but to understand the full scope of your artistic development." David's expression brightened with enthusiasm that broke through his usual careful reserve. "I could play some of them for you sometime. They're not all violin pieces. I've written some piano works and a few songs with lyrics." Victoria felt surprised by the breadth of his musical interests, though she realized she shouldn't be given Sarah's piano background and David's apparent absorption of diverse musical influences during his unconventional education. "I'd very much like to hear them." As their meeting concluded, Victoria found herself reluctant to end the conversation despite having covered all necessary business details. The combination of professional collaboration and personal discovery created dynamics she hadn't experienced with other artists, making their interactions more complex but also more meaningful than typical industry relationships. "David," she said as he prepared to leave, "I want you to know that working with you has been one of the most rewarding professional experiences I've had in years." David paused, studying her face as if evaluating her sincerity. "Thank you. It's meant a lot to me too, having the opportunity to document my music properly." After David left, Victoria remained in her office, listening to his recordings again, hearing new details with each repetition. The more time she spent with his music, the more convinced she became that his artistic vision deserved broader recognition and professional development. But beyond commercial considerations, she felt proud of what he had accomplished independently, the artistic maturity he had achieved despite circumstances that might have prevented other young musicians from developing their talents. That evening, Victoria made several calls to industry contacts who specialized in developing emerging classical artists. Without mentioning David's identity or their relationship, she described his musical abilities and gauge interest in the type of crossover classical work his compositions represented. The responses were encouraging. Several programmers expressed interest in new classical artists who could appeal to younger demographics, particularly those with original compositions that bridged traditional and contemporary influences. David's street performance background might actually be advantageous, providing compelling narrative context for marketing his eventual recordings. Victoria also contacted conductors who had experience with orchestral arrangements of contemporary classical pieces. Mother's Waltz and Ascending seemed particularly suited for string ensemble treatment that might enhance their commercial appeal while preserving their essential artistic character. Over the following weeks, Victoria developed a comprehensive strategy for David's artistic development that would provide opportunities for growth while respecting his insistence on creative control. The plan included additional recording sessions, orchestral arrangements of selected pieces, and potential performance opportunities that might showcase his abilities to industry professionals and new audiences. When she presented the strategy to David during their next meeting, his reaction combined gratitude with characteristic caution about accepting assistance that might create obligations he wasn't prepared to fulfill. "This is generous," he said after reviewing her detailed proposals, "but I need to understand what expectations come with these opportunities." Victoria had anticipated his concerns and prepared responses that emphasized his artistic independence, while acknowledging the mutual benefits that successful collaboration might provide. "My primary interest is documenting and developing exceptional music. Your success would reflect well on my label's reputation for discovering new talent." David studied the documents she had prepared, taking time to consider each element of the proposed development plan. Victoria watched him evaluate opportunities with the same careful analysis she had observed during their personal conversations, weighing potential benefits against possible compromises to his autonomy. "I'm interested," David said finally. "But I want to proceed gradually, evaluating each step before committing to the next." Victoria nodded, understanding his need to maintain control over his artistic trajectory, while also appreciating his willingness to explore possibilities for growth and development. "We'll take it one project at a time." Their professional relationship continued to evolve over the following months as David recorded additional compositions and worked with arrangers to develop orchestral versions of selected pieces. Victoria watched his confidence grow as he experienced positive responses from industry professionals who appreciated his unique artistic voice. The success of their collaboration gradually created space for their personal relationship to develop. As well, David began accepting occasional dinner invitations, sharing stories about his life, and asking questions about Victoria's career and experiences. Their conversations remained somewhat formal, but the defensive barriers that had initially defined their interactions slowly lowered as trust developed. One evening, as they reviewed final mixes of David's first professional album, Victoria felt compelled to address the personal dynamics that had shaped their relationship since discovering their connection. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that getting to know you has changed how I think about family and success and what makes life meaningful." David looked up from the recording console, meeting her gaze with an expression that combined surprise with cautious openness. "How so?" Victoria chose her words thoughtfully, wanting to be honest without creating pressure or expectations that might damage their fragile connection. "I built my career believing that professional achievement was the most important measure of a life well lived. Knowing you, seeing what you've accomplished independently, has made me realize that success can take many forms." David considered her words before responding. "Mom used to say that success meant being true to your values while contributing something positive to the world. She thought you were successful because you elevated classical music and helped other artists achieve their goals." Victoria felt moved by Sarah's generous interpretation of her career choices, particularly given the personal costs that professional focus had imposed on their relationship. "Your mother was a remarkable woman. I regret not having the opportunity to know her better. She would have liked seeing us work together," David said quietly. "She always hoped you would have the chance to know me someday, though she probably didn't imagine it happening through music." Victoria realized that their professional collaboration had created the foundation for personal relationship that might not have been possible under different circumstances. Music provided common ground that transcended their complicated history, allowing them to discover shared values and compatible personalities gradually. "I'm grateful we found each other," Victoria said honestly, "even if the timing wasn't what either of us might have chosen." David's expression softened with something that might have been affection, the first time Victoria had seen him lower his emotional guard completely. "I'm glad too. It's nice to understand where some of my musical instincts come from." As David's album neared completion, Victoria began receiving inquiries from performance venues interested in booking him for concerts showcasing his original compositions. The combination of his compelling personal story and exceptional musical abilities created marketing opportunities that might launch his career beyond street performance toward professional recognition. When she presented these performance opportunities to David, his reaction reflected the growth in trust and confidence that had developed between them over months of collaboration. "I think I'm ready," he said, studying concert proposals with excitement that he no longer felt obligated to hide. "It's time to see whether audiences beyond street corners connect with this music." Victoria felt proud of his courage in accepting challenges that would test his artistic maturity while also expanding his professional horizons. The young man who had defensively guarded his independence months earlier was now willing to risk vulnerability in pursuit of artistic growth. The album's release generated positive reviews from classical music critics who praised David's original compositions and distinctive artistic voice. Several pieces received radio airplay on classical stations, introducing his music to audiences who might never have encountered him through street performance. More significantly for David's long-term career development, the recordings attracted attention from established classical musicians who expressed interest in collaborating on future projects. His unique background and fresh compositional approach offered possibilities for musical partnerships that might expand his artistic horizons while maintaining his creative independence. As they celebrated the album's successful reception during a quiet dinner at their usual restaurant, Victoria reflected on how their relationship had evolved from chance encounter through professional collaboration towards something approaching genuine family connection. "What are you thinking about?" David asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "How different my life is now compared to a year ago," Victoria replied honestly. "How much richer it feels to have someone to share successes with." David smiled with warmth that transformed his features, making him look younger and more carefree than Victoria had ever seen him. "It's nice having someone who understands what this music means to me." Victoria realized that their relationship had become something neither of them had initially expected or sought. Professional collaboration had created space for personal discovery that transcended their complicated origins, resulting in connection based on shared values and mutual respect rather than mere biological relationship. "I love you," Victoria said simply, the words emerging without conscious decision but feeling entirely natural once spoken. David's eyes reflected surprise followed by recognition of something he had probably been feeling but hadn't known how to express. "I love you too," he replied quietly. "It took me a while to understand that loving someone doesn't mean giving up independence." Victoria felt tears of gratitude for the wisdom David had gained through his difficult experiences, wisdom that had enabled him to remain open to relationship despite having every reason to protect himself from disappointment. His capacity for love, despite abandonment, reflected Sarah's influence, but also his own remarkable emotional maturity. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Victoria felt aware that they had crossed a threshold from which their relationship would continue evolving in directions neither could entirely predict. The foundation they had built through music and mutual respect provided stability for whatever personal discoveries might follow. "Thank you," Victoria said, as they stood outside the restaurant, city lights creating a backdrop for what felt like a new beginning. "For what?" David asked. "For giving me the chance to know who you are," Victoria replied. "For letting me be part of your life despite everything that kept us apart before." David's response came in the form of an embrace, the first physical affection they had shared since discovering their relationship. The gesture felt natural and healing, acknowledging both their connection and their commitment to building something authentic moving forward. As they parted ways, Victoria felt optimistic about their future together, while also understanding that their relationship would continue requiring patience, understanding, and respect for each other's independence. They had discovered that family could be created through choice and effort, rather than simply inherited through genetics, and that love could develop gradually through trust and shared experience. David's success as a recording artist continued to grow over the following months, with concert bookings and collaboration opportunities that established him as an emerging voice in contemporary classical music. Victoria supported his career development while also enjoying their evolving personal relationship, discovering that professional and family pride could coexist beautifully when based on genuine respect and affection. Their story had begun with a chance encounter that neither had anticipated, but it had developed into something that enriched both their lives in ways that neither success nor independence alone could have provided. Through music, they had found each other and created a relationship that honored both their individual strengths and their shared commitment to artistic excellence and personal growth. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.